All set?
Yep,
Yes.
all set.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Today I am going to talk about something that I just discovered a couple months ago. That Betty Crocker is buried in Mount Albion.
Oh, what? She is.
Before there was Emerald Lagasse, Paula Dean, Alton Brown, there was Betty Crocker. And Betty Crocker was begun by the Washburn Flour Company, a forerunner of General Mills. They published a promotion in the Saturday Evening Post. They sent a completed, people were asked to send in a completed jigsaw puzzle, would receive a flour sack pincushion. There were over 30,000 responses, hundreds of letters and questions about baking. So, one of the advertising directors saw an opportunity and convinced the company leaders to invent a fictional character to personally reply to each inquiry. So they had multiple people working on answering these questions that got sent in. The name Betty was chosen as she seemed friendly and wholesome. And Crocker was chosen to honor a recently retired company director. So that's how you got the name Betty Crocker. After using her name in print advertising and letters containing cooking advice, Betty Crocker got her voice on the radio in 1924. First in Minneapolis and then nationally on NBC Network. The Betty Crocker School of the Air was the country's first radio cooking show. During the Great Depression, she advised cash-strapped homemakers how to cook tasty meals on a tightened budget. In 1945, according to the Fortune magazine, Betty Crocker was the second most famous American woman after Eleanor Roosevelt. These broadcasts from 1945 are dedicated to young, attractive, and gallant war brides. They gave helpful cooking advice to the young brides, and they also had celebrations of their spirit, which is the reflection of the virtues that their pioneer foremothers showed crossing the plains and wagon trains. So they really pushed the idea of Americans for Americans, and women had their part to do in the war. There were 2 rare episodes of Betty Crocker cooking and a short blooper expert. For more radio cooking, see Betty Crocker of the West and Mary Lee program sponsored by Pet Milk and Baker's Theater of Stars, Cooking an Old-Time Radio Collection. I can vaguely remember being a young girl listening to the radio with my grandmother. And I can remember hearing Betty Crocker on the radio. Now I was born in 47, so I wasn't very big when that was still on the radio. And apparently at the time that I was listening to it, it was Betty Crocker from here that was the voice. Betty Crocker was discussed in Jimmy Stewart on the Air, which was a radio program. Betty Crocker show was on the air for 29 years. Several women, including Zella Lane, Betty Bucholz, which is the one buried here, Adelaide Hawley, played the role of Betty Crocker on the program through the years. She was on the Jimmy Stewart program that being on the show broadcast February 25th, 1952. So then we can add a second show. Hawley had the role of Crocker at this point and would have been the hostess for this appearance by Jimmy Stewart. So Betty Crocker was even on the Jimmy Stewart show. She's a very popular, well-known person. In 1924, Crocker acquired a voice with the debut of the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air. It was the country's first radio cooking program. Blanche Ingersoll, followed by Houston, were selected to portray Betty Crocker. The show proved popular and eventually was carried nationally by NBC Radio. Over the next 3 decades, women would anonymously play Betty Crocker on the air and the cooking school. So there were several women who played Betty Crocker, starting in 1924. A person would play Betty Crocker for a while, and then maybe they had a personal reason for retiring and they would put somebody else in to play the voice of Betty Crocker on the radio. That's where this is interesting, because they didn't need one person to be Betty Crocker. This was a radio show, and so there was no visual to it. So they could put in a different woman as Betty Crocker, and unless there was a real difference in her voice, people wouldn't necessarily know the difference. So there was more than one person that played Betty Crocker. That 1924, the Washburn-Crosby Company bought a faltering radio station named it WCCO. On October 2nd, the first Betty Crocker home service program premiered on the station. The Betty voiced by Washburn at the Crosby Home Economics, Blanche Ingersoll, promoted good cooking as the secret to a happy home. The following year, the Betty Crocker School of the Air was offering listeners a chance to cook along with Betty. In 27 years on the air, over 1 million people completed the program. By the end of 1925, the 2 radio programs were on the air in 12 regional markets. While different women voiced Betty in each city, they read scripts in the main Betty Crocker office in Minneapolis. In the 1950s brought changes for Betty Crocker. The step-by-step instructions of the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook helped to make it, take it apart, a bestseller. In 1954, General Mills introduced Betty Crocker's red spoon logo that gave cookbooks, cake mixes, and other items the Betty seal of approval. We have 2 or 3 Betty Crocker cookbooks here.
I have one
In the
home.
library. You have one at home? Yep. And they're still popular today.
They are.
In 1958, the Betty Crocker test kitchens moved from Minneapolis to General Mills headquarters in Golden Valley. Tour guides often found themselves consoling guests who'd been shocked to find that their cooking heroine wasn't real. So they went there to see Betty Crocker, and there was no Betty Crocker to see. Betty Crocker's popularity waned in the later decades of the 20th century. However, cookbooks, recipes, and products bearing her logo, signature, and portrait continued to be produced. In 1996, a new Betty Crocker portrait was made by blending the faces of 75 contestant winners with a previous portrait to create Betty for the next century. So what they did was they made up what she looked like. And it was a combination of different portraits of her, different sketches. No, I don't put my hand on it. Oh, here it is. This is what the composite ended up looking like. Was a 1950s looking female. It takes a lot to be recognized, and Betty Crocker has managed to stay on the top for nearly 100 years. A 2015 New York Daily News article ranked her as one of 8 most influential fictional figures, along with Santa Claus, Barbie, and Uncle Sam.
We have 2 of those here.
Yeah. Hey, we're on a roll. And her popularity isn't just homegrown. The Middle East is Betty Crocker's second largest market after the U.S. And a tour of the site showcases distinctly regional recipes, including everything from strawberry rosewater cream to 30 recipes for Ramadan. So she's branched out worldwide now. As previously mentioned, Marjorie Child Houston was the voice of Betty Crocker, as well as an economist and editor of cookbooks, but she was also quite serious about empowering women. According to an article from the American Association of the University of Women, Houston believed the work she did as Betty Crocker gave women a sense of importance. In 1948, in recognition of her pioneering work, President Harry Truman awarded Houston with the Women of the Year Award from the Women's National Press Club. It was an honor she shared that year with Eleanor Roosevelt, Grandma Moses, Portland Mayor Dorothy McHugh Lee. Her advice actually came from a crack team of home economists, some of whom have been called upon to write Betty's cookbooks and bread baking books. So they had a crew that made up Betty Crocker, and the recipes also. She hosted her first radio cooking show in 1924, and it was a hit. For 2 decades, her voice actually belonged to Marjorie Child Houston, who also wrote and hosted the program. After getting picked up nationally by NBC, the show went on to become one of the longest-running radio shows in history, regularly drawing more than 1 million listeners. In 1943, when America went off to war, Betty Crocker pitched in to do her part. She produced a mealtime guide so women at home could help the war effort by learning how to stretch everything: meat, vegetables, and even fat rations. Betty's more than 250 cookbooks have always been gobbled up by her fans, nationally and internationally. Her first book, published in 1950, was Betty Crocker's Picture Cookbook. It sold nearly 2 million copies in its first 2 years and is now in its 21st edition, with distribution of well over 75 million copies. This is something that started in 1924. I think that's phenomenal. Said to be the most popular cookbook in American history, it's been nicknamed Big Red or the Kitchen Bible. I think that's appropriate. Having proven herself to be queen of the culinary arts for 100 years, I don't expect that we'll be seeing an end to Betty Crocker's reign anytime soon. Now, the woman who is buried here was the last voice of Betty Crocker on the radio. Her name was Agnes B. for Barbara, I believe, Lutz, L-U-T-Z. She married, and the headline was, Betty Crocker of the radio is to wed Arden Buchholz. So Betty Crocker married Arden Buchholz April 15th, 1929. It was in the New York Times. By the change of the century, by 2002, she lived in Waterport. It says in here, she'll try out her new theories. Princeton, New Jersey, April 15th. Betty Crocker, known to millions as a radio speaker on household affairs, is going to try out her own theories. She's married Arden Buchholz of Fillmore, California, a childhood sweetheart. Her real name was Agnes B. Lutz. After getting Agnes Betty Lutz's full information, this person who did the research said he found quite a bit. He found a picture of her tombstone, which was inscribed Voice of Betty Crocker. And that's the tombstone that's in our cemetery. And this was a man who did research on her because he was related to the Lutz family. And he'd heard that Betty Crocker had been a member of his family. So he did the research. And he found the headstone in our library, which I think is quite phenomenal. He traced it down that far. She also, after she did the stint as Betty Crocker, she also did one as the voice of Campbell's Soup. And that's where this picture of her is Ann Marshall. She was actually Betty Buchholz. And so she went from being Betty Crocker to Ann Marshall for the soup company in the 1950s. Her obituary was in the Albion paper, and it reads, Voice of Betty Crocker, Albion, New York. Betty Buchholz died May 24th. She was 99. Born Agnes Barbara Lutz in Princeton, She lived in New York City, Fillmore, California, Chicago, and Connecticut. She was the radio voice of Betty Crocker for many years on NBC Radio Network's Cooking School of the Air. She was the daughter of parents who immigrated from Germany in 1900 and from an early age helped her father in his Princeton bakery. During her youth in Princeton, she worked as a babysitter, personal secretary, secretary to the Princeton Summer School. She played women's basketball at Princeton High School. In 1923, she moved to Greenwich Village in Manhattan and was a greeting hostess for a radio station, later becoming a morning announcer and hostess for its Women's Hour show. In 1927, the NBC affiliate began to broadcast Cooking School of the Air, and she became one of 5 or 6 Betty Crockers across the country who announced 15 minutes of recipes and homespun philosophy. So at that time, the radios didn't have one nationally produced. You had a local one that because of the span of the United States. So you had more than one Betty Crocker, more than one individual portraying Betty Crocker on the radio. In 1929, she moved to California to join her new husband in his newspaper publishing business, the Fillmore Herald. After the paper failed during the Great Depression, she returned to broadcasting in Los Angeles. In 1934, General Mills named her the single national voice of Betty Crocker, and she moved to Chicago, hosting NBC's Cooking School of the Air 3 times a week for the next 17 years. She received upwards of 5,000 letters a week from show's million members. Announcers included Hugh Downs and Don Amici. In 1951, she moved to New York and took the role of Ann Marshall, Campbell Soup's national media voice. She worked for the Eisenhower presidential campaign in 1952 and retired from broadcasting in 1955. She volunteered for reading for the blind in Great Neck, New York, and the Connecticut State Library for the blind, physically handicapped in Hartford, Connecticut. Daughter of the late Jacob and Ann Lutz, wife of the late Arden Bucholz, she is survived by son and daughter-in-law Arden and Sue Bucholz of Waterport, New York, brothers Jake Lutz of Princeton and Carl Lutz of Winsted, Connecticut, grandsons Merritt Bucholz of Dublin, Ireland, and Mark Bucholz of New York City, and 2 great-granddaughters. Memorial services will be held at Princeton later this year. The lady really got around. She was really a national person. She lived in Albion in, 2002. She lived from 1903 to 2002. Bucholz lived on Roosevelt Highway in Waterport in 1985. So she was here and lived here until her death, so from 1985 to 2002. I think one thing I have to leave you with that I kind of fell over, didn't even know about my own family. Our oldest son, Bill, when he got out of school, he worked for the Medina paper as a reporter. And I tripped over an article that he wrote about Bucholz and the Talking Imperial Germany Blues. He interviewed Betty Bucholz's son, Arden, in Waterport for an article on a book that he had written. And that was in 1997. So I have to call my son and say, hey, we tripped over each other. I guess that's all I really want to get into today, but thank you for listening, and I think it's really something to find out that we had a nationally known personality buried in Mount Albion.
I got married in 1953, and one of my shower gifts was a Betty Crocker cookbook, which I still have falling apart.
Because
so
you use it so much.
But I won't give it up. And then after that, and I don't know how long after that, Betty Crocker had several other cookbooks, and they were where you could add to it, you know. And as they put out the new cookbooks, all the good recipes from the old book, they eliminated them.
Oh no!
So
you had to keep the old book. You had to keep the old book and add the new one to it.
Well, maybe that's what I should do. But anyway, it is falling apart. I am still, and the pages are no longer, you know, just stuck in. But there's some good
recipes. Yep.
That don't add for 5 different ingredients.
Right.
And really taste quite good.
Yes. Yes. So, well, they sure stayed popular from the 1924 on. I think it's quite something because I can remember my grandmother having Betty Crocker cookbooks, and my mother had one, and there's 2 here yet. They're still in the library. We still used Betty Crocker cookbooks, and I think it was quite something. I tripped over the idea that Betty Bucholz was buried in Mount Albion.
She's hard to find. She's hard to find.
Yeah,
because you have to go up on a little hill.
Right.
So if you go in the main entrance where the chapel is, and then there's that triangle area, if you go to that first little curve, and then you have to go up just one level, and it's very close to a mausoleum that's in the hill, and it says Root on top of it. So it's just to the right of that, but you can see it. She's very close to the end of that.
Well, I think it's really phenomenal. The more I've researched now, well, of course we know about Santa Claus being here, and Betty Crocker, and we also had a gentleman, which I did a talk on, who was the artist for Walt Disney, Hank Porter, and he was raised here. There's 3 national figures that are here in Mount Albion, well, or in Albion per se.
I went to nursery school here in the 60s, I believe it was, and Sue Bucholz and her husband lived in Waterport, and their 2 children both came, Merritt and Mark.
Oh, they were both, you knew of them.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Well, another proof that they were here.
Exactly. But I didn't know the connection at that time.
Right. But here we had Betty Crocker right here in Orleans County. Okay, well, thank you for listening.
Well, very nice.
Yeah. And I'm not sure when my next talk will be. I've got a hip operation coming in a couple of weeks, so I have to see how that goes. Yeah.
The role of refiner.
I might have to, yeah. I could do a lot of research laying in bed.
Zoom. There you go.
We'll zoom her in, that's right. From her hospital.
Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
You know, my mom has, it's about this big, and it's wire bound. And she received it for one of her showers, and it's the Betty Crocker Cookies cookbook. She uses that thing constantly. It's dog ear, just like you said. Sheets are coming out of it.
Falling out, and
She loves it.
And I was interested at one point in getting a new one.
Yes.
And I was looking at it at the bookstore. I'm thinking, wait a minute. I thought Rick would pay that much money for.
Yeah.
Because I had my favorite recipes weren't in there. I was going to retire that one that was falling apart on me.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
you can't
I still
retire.
have that.
Yeah. And one of the daughters is going to want that, I'm sure, at some point. They'll want those
Well,
recipes.
Heaven knows I don't throw anything.
It's a go-to cookbook, though. It just is.
It's not just cookable.
Yeah, but the kids will call and say, Mom, you remember when you made such and such? How did you do that? I got one of those calls this week.
Yeah.
But it's fun to know these little trivia things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Orleans County is getting more and more popular with us because we've attended your.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, it's been fun digging around trying to find and amazed at what I have found.
I know. I'm
Not
amazed at
because
what
I'm
you
so
found.
good, but because I tripped over something.
Yeah.
else.
And it's right
Oh,
in
wait a
front of
minute.
us.
That's Betty Crocker. What's he got to do with Albion?
I know. Exactly.
Yeah,
How did you trip over it? Do you remember?
I don't honestly remember. It might have been that her stone was in Mount Albion.
Okay.
I might have read an article
Sure.
on
You
that.
I've seen it. Yeah,
Yeah, but it's amazing
it is.
what even has been here and is no longer here.
Right.
But like Lipton's was here, and
Right.
some of the big name companies.
Bird's Eye was
Bird's
here.
Eye was here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's amazing the history of this area. Yeah, and Orleans County has. I was just talking to somebody the other day, and she said, we ought to do posters at like an event. I said, do you know that?
Yeah.
Betty Crocker lived in Orleans County, because they were names that I had heard when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
But to think that I moved somewhere. I moved from Pennsylvania to Williamson, New York, to here. And here I find out that Betty Crocker, that I used to listen to with my grandmother on the radio,
Yeah.
is buried here.
Yeah.
It opens up your eyes and you go, oh, wait a minute. Gets you interested.
But there was an original Betty Crocker, and
Yeah, they made Betty Crocker up. The person
that's
was made
what
up.
she was made up.
And they
I didn't know.
found someone to be the voice
Voice
of Betty
of-
Crocker on the radio.
Okay.
And they would have gotten away with it if we hadn't invented television. And somebody would say, hey, call Betty. Well, there was no Betty to call because they were women who used their voice to represent Betty Crocker.
Okay.
But there wasn't any real
There wasn't
Betty
any
Crocker.
Betty Crocker.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you.